MiG-35 YouTube script, there's a moment in the life of almost every fighter jet where the people who built it realize they've already lost, not to an enemy, not in combat, but to time. The MiG-35 had that moment, and it happened. Before the plane even existed, go back to the early 1980s. The Soviet Union is commissioning one of its most capable fighters, yet the MiG-29, clean lines, twin engines, built to match anything the Americans were flying. The designers at the Mikoyan Bureau are proud of it. But here's the thing almost no one talks about. The same engineers who signed off on the MiG-29 already knew it wasn't enough. They knew it the moment the ink dried. The plane they had just built was already a step behind where the world was heading, and they had maybe a decade before that gap became dangerous. So quietly, almost immediately, they started working on what came next. What followed was one of the stranger chapters in modern aviation history, a fighter jet that spent decades being born, killed, revived, rejected, rebuilt, and then finally, quietly put into service, just as the world started asking whether it still needed it at all. But that's getting ahead of things, because before any of that, there was a decision made in a Moscow design bureau that set everything in motion, and the full weight of that decision only becomes clear much later. The upgraded design was called the MiG-29M by the late 1980s. It existed 6 flying prototypes, a broader weapons range, better reliability, real improvements that actually mattered. The Soviet military was interested. The path forward seemed obvious. And then the Soviet Union collapsed. Almost overnight, Russia couldn't afford to buy fighter jets it had already built. The MiG-29 acquisition program stopped entirely in 1992. New prototypes sat in hangars. The MiG-29M, fully developed, combat-capable. Better in nearly every measurable way than the jet it was meant to replace, was quietly shelved, not scrapped, not canceled with a formal announcement, just left there. While the country went through an economic freefall that made fighter jet development feel almost absurd. But here's what makes this story different from a dozen others just like it. The team didn't stop with no government contract and no guarantee anyone would ever buy what they were building. The engineers at Mikoyan kept working. On their own, with their own resources. This is the part that tends to get glossed over. That the aircraft, which eventually became the MiG-35, was kept alive through a period where, by any rational measure, it should have died. The passion of a small group of people who believed in what they were making is the only reason this jet exists. And this is where the story starts to get uncomfortable. Because passion and belief don't always translate into results. Sometimes they lead you to walk into the most important room of your career with a prototype that isn't ready. That room was India. In the mid-2000s, the Indian Air Force announced what became known in defense circles as the mother of all tenders. They needed 126 new multi-role fighter jets. The contract was worth billions. Every major manufacturer on Earth wanted it. Eurofighter with the Typhoon, Boeing with the F/A-18 Super Hornet, Lockheed with the F-16, Dassault with the Rafale, Saab with the Gripen, and Mikoyan with a newly renamed aircraft they were now calling the MiG-35. Presented in India in 2007 with the weight of 3 decades of work sitting on its wings. What happened next determined the fate of the entire program. The MiG-35 lost. France's Rafale was selected as the winner. And on the surface, the explanations were straightforward. India already operated a large Russian fleet, the Su-30 on land and the MiG-29K at sea. And the logical instinct to diversify suppliers played a real role. The French jets also had a history with the Indian Air Force, the Jaguar and the Mirage having served for years. But underneath the diplomatic language and the official reasoning was something harder to say out loud. The MiG-35's own prototype had failed to meet its own promised specifications. Systems that were supposed to be ready weren't. Things that had been presented as complete were still being developed. In the highest stakes tender in the aircraft's history. The plane had walked in underprepared. The engineers went back to work. What came out of that period of rebuilding is genuinely a different aircraft underneath a familiar skin. The fuselage looks almost identical to the MiG-29. The silhouette is the same, but open it up and the differences are significant. The maximum takeoff weight jumped from around 18,000 kilograms to over 24,000. A 6.5-ton increase that reflects not just more fuel, but a fundamentally heavier and more capable airframe. The chassis was reinforced, borrowed directly from the MiG-29K carrier variant, which had to survive the violence of carrier landings. That gave the MiG-35 something unusual: ability to operate from short and damaged runways that would cripple most of its competitors. The service life went from 2,500 hours to 6,000. Operating costs dropped by more than half, 8 hardpoints instead of 6. With the ability to carry the full range of modern Russian air-to-surface weapons, a capability the original MiG-29 never had. The old MiG-29 was a dogfighter. The MiG-35 is something closer to a true multi-role aircraft. The avionics were rebuilt from scratch. Fly-by-wire replacing the old manual hydraulic system. The JUCMI radar with active electronically scanned array, technology capable of tracking 30 targets, simultaneously at 160 kilometers, placed it alongside some of the most advanced fourth-generation fighters currently flying anywhere in the world. On paper, it's a serious aircraft, which makes what came next all the more interesting, because the MiG-35's real competition was never the F-35 or the Eurofighter. It was never about beating the West. The fight that actually mattered, the one that determined whether the MiG-35 had a future, was happening inside Russia. Against the Su-35, the Su-35 is heavier, more powerful, and carries more. It's been the centerpiece of Russian tactical aviation for years. And when you're a military buyer deciding between these two aircraft, the pitch for the MiG-35 has to be built entirely on being cheaper, simpler, and good enough. Not better, good enough. That's a harder sell than it sounds. Because good enough is a position that requires every other thing to go right. Price, availability, production speed. The MiG-35 had to be cheaper than the Su-35 and better than the old MiG-29 fleet it was meant to replace. It had to thread a needle that didn't leave much room for error. The Russian Aerospace Forces ordered 24 aircraft. It's not nothing. But it's not the kind of number that speaks to overwhelming confidence either. Production has been slow. International sales have been limited. The countries most likely to buy partners in Asia and the Middle East already operating legacy Russian aircraft are weighing an aging platform against a world that's moving quickly toward fifth-generation jets, even if that move is happening more slowly than the headlines suggest. And this is the question the MiG-35 can't quite escape. Not whether it's capable, it clearly is, but whether capable is still enough. The F-35 exists. The Su-57 is being commissioned. The window in which a refined fourth-generation fighter represents genuine value is real, but it is not permanent. The MiG-35 arrived late to the competition it needed to win, lost that competition in the most public way possible, rebuilt itself quietly, and then entered service in a world that had already started to move on. There's something worth sitting with in that. A jet that was kept alive by people who refused to let it die. That survived collapse and rejection and a failed prototype. That, by most technical assessments, became something genuinely capable. And that may still end up being a footnote, not because it wasn't good enough, but because timing, politics, and the brutal pace of aviation development don't wait for anyone to get their prototype ready. Whether the MiG-35 gets the orders it needs to justify those 3 decades of development, that question is still open. And the answer, when it comes, will say something not just about the aircraft, but about what it costs to keep believing in something long after the practical case for doing so has disappeared.